How did pharaohs build the pyramids? The first thing we need to understand is that not all pyramids were built in the same way. The Egyptians built about 100 of them over a period of around 2,000 years. Most of the pyramids were built on the Giza Plateau, but there was one at Abusir and another at Dashur. They didn't want to waste time and effort transporting the material too far, thanks. We know that they moved them on sledges. Ancient Egyptians invented a type of sledge for every purpose, and the stone sledges were the largest. At first, Egyptologists thought that these were remains of a ritualistic animal sacrifice. Well, it seems that the reason has to do with resources and logistics. As the pyramids grew taller and taller, the number of workers required to build them also increased. And so did the amount of food and other supplies needed to sustain them. By the end of the Old Kingdom, Egypt faced serious economic and social problems. Floods disrupted agriculture, causing widespread famine and instability. The central authority lost control of the country and Egypt plunged into chaos. How did we figure out how the Egyptians built the pyramids? Let's find out. It took centuries for the nation to recover and rebuild itself. He was born in 1773 and died in 1829. In 1814, he presented his translation of the stone to the public, thereby opening the door to understanding ancient Egypt. But Young wasn't done with deciphering the hieroglyphs yet. He was convinced that behind those mysterious signs lay a secret alphabet. Unfortunately, Young never finished his research. He devoted his last years to studying the human brain, and that is not so well known today. But we need to remember that his contribution to Egyptology was enormous. But then they realized that the quantities of wood and animals were too great to be offerings to the gods. Shangpal Young managed to decipher the remaining hieroglyphs, but he didn't discover the alphabet. It was Flinders Petrie. He was an English engineer and archaeologist who spent many years excavating pyramids. While doing so, he noticed that the hieroglyphic signs didn't always mean the same thing. Sometimes they were used phonetically to represent sounds, just like our letters. This revolutionary idea led him to discover the phonetic values of the majority of the Egyptian signs. He literally laid the foundations of the study of the Egyptian language and opened the door to modern Egyptology. They concluded that the pieces of wood were part of a ramp that had collapsed, slid down, and ended up in the sacrificial pit. Other times, as in the case of the second pyramid at Giza, perhaps the builders simply ran out of resources or encountered unexpected geological problems. In that case, the rock was full of faults and the structure became unsafe. There was even an earthquake that damaged the northern face of the unfinished pyramid. These abandoned structures were left half-built, and the ancient city of Cairo gradually consumed them, brick by brick. How does that explain the animal bones? Well, it turned out that some parts of the skeletons were being used as tools. Why are only 3 pyramids visible today? What happened to the others? Well, the answer is destruction. It wasn't until Napoleon's campaign in Egypt in 1798 that European travelers rediscovered them. Everyone wanted to see the remnants of the ancient Egyptian civilization, and that's why we have paintings, sketches, and books that immortalized the pyramids as we knew them in the late 18th century. Today, 7 wonders of the world are preserved only thanks to the efforts of archaeologists who managed to save them from destruction. Over the centuries, Egypt went through many periods of turmoil, and invaders who didn't appreciate the cultural heritage of the Egyptians robbed the pyramids of their treasures and destroyed them for building materials. For example, in 1302, a severe drought caused an uprising against the governor. The peasants attacked the necropolis at Giza and smashed the Sphinx's nose. The people of Cairo used the limestone blocks to build mosques and houses. And by the 16th century, only the 3 big pyramids were still standing. For example, the shin bone could be tied at both ends and used like a lever. Using these primitive tools, the Egyptians built the ramp that led to the top of the pyramid. When the stones reached the top, the ramp became part of the structure and the workers dismantled it. Today, scientists can confirm that this method really worked because they reconstructed it and actually built a ramp using exactly the same techniques the Egyptians used. They had runners made of wood and metal, and the stones rested on a thick layer of mud. Wet mud was the key to moving heavy loads. Sledges could carry 20 tons over distances of 10 kilometers without breaking into a sweat. A team of oxen pulled them, though sometimes they needed the help of rollers. These were large cylinders made of wood or stone. The oxen would pull the sledge onto the roller and then roll it to where it needed to go. They also used wooden ramps to take the stone blocks higher and higher. But how did they manage to lift the enormous stones to the top of the pyramid? There were many theories, but Egyptologists finally came up with a solution. They discovered what they called the sacrificial ramp. The foundation was carefully prepared, digging a hole, compacting the soil, and laying a base course of large stones. This was the platform upon which the whole structure would rest. And they improved their techniques along the way. So the design and construction methods changed from pyramid to pyramid. But today, we're going to focus on the most famous ones, the ones built by the 4th dynasty pharaohs during the Old Kingdom, Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, and their predecessors. These are the big limestone pyramids at Giza and Abusir. The work began with selecting the site. They chose level ground close to the capital, Memphis. But how did they cut such perfect blocks of stone? What tools did they use? The answer is that they didn't use any. Modern historians used to think that the Egyptians invented the copper axe and saw specifically to build the pyramids, but it turns out they didn't. Archaeologists found no evidence of saws or axes in the ancient Egyptian sites. Instead, they used a simple tool made of a hard piece of wood, like acacia, and a mallet made of a different type of harder wood, like sycamore. It was called a dolerite hammer. With these primitive tools, they chipped away at the bedrock until they reached a suitable depth. Then they wedged in a copper chisel and hammered it in to split the rock. The workers moved further up, cutting courses of stones that were initially quite rough. As they progressed, they cut more precise lines to make the stones fit together better. Finally, when the block was shaped, they smoothed its surface with a copper chisel. This was a very slow process, but surprisingly effective. A team of 50 men could cut 30 meters squared of stone per day. In total, it took about 2 million people 20 years to build Khufu's pyramid. That's an average of 100,000 workers for each of its 4 sides. I hope you're enjoying this episode. If so, don't forget to subscribe. Once the base was ready and the stones cut, the workers started building the pyramid. But how exactly did they move those huge blocks? It is based on the discovery of a series of pits filled with fragments of wood and animal bones at the foot of several pyramids. And that brings us to the question, why did they stop building pyramids? What happened to the unfinished pyramids? We'll tell you next. Some of the pyramids weren't completed for various reasons. Sometimes a pharaoh died and his successor didn't feel like continuing his father's project. So we come to a new question. In fact, they might have been saved precisely because they were half buried in the sand. But the greatest wonder is how we uncovered the secrets of the pyramids. How did we learn to read hieroglyphs? Hi, guys. I'm sure you remember the brilliant young scholar who decoded the Rosetta Stone. His name was Thomas Young. His work inspired Jean-François Champollion. He also lived in France, but died earlier in 1832. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye.